And it was
All right. Good morning, everybody. Apparently, I'm solo this morning because nobody responds. Your Zoom etiquette is totally jacked up.
good
Good
morning, Joe.
morning.
Hey, there we go. I was like, maybe I just need another shot of Monster.
There you go.
Happy Monday.
Hey,
Jeff, dude, your beard's looking great. It's just in time for Christmas.
Thanks, Matt.
Hey, listen, thank you everybody for getting on the call. We have a lot of things to cover today. So I'm just going to jump right in, but I always have on the agenda, open it up real quickly for anybody who had a quick win in the past week. And let me frame that up. Anything business related? Well, listen, if it's something cool in your private life, go ahead and share that. But, something specifically, maybe with the new changes that have come about, contractual issues, anything, a win in those categories. Fire off real quick. Anybody? Nicole, are you firing off?
Oh, sorry, I need to mute. Sorry, that was Will. I mean, Wesley.
That's okay. Nicole, in case you guys don't know, is my daughter. And so hearing my grandkids in the background is kind of a good thing. So, all right, well, listen, if you got no wins, that's a sad statement. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I took a buyer call from Roger's Zillow stuff, and I always was kind of hesitant about how that would go down, but just explained to the gentleman, that I'm not the listing agent, but I have professional service that goes beyond the reach of most agents, and that I would be representing him in this purchase, and explained to him the whole situation. Made it just so lighthearted. He was elated to work with me. So we just move forward. Don't make it a big deal. Just explain to them what's going on, and they'll understand and move on.
You know what? That sounds, you put it in a very nonchalant way, and I'm glad you did, because so much of our success in dealing with people, I mean, you could put this in the category of neuro-linguistic programming, if you're familiar with that, match and mirror, mirror and match. The way we project ourselves is how people tend to react back. So if we're making things really nervous and jittery and, oh my gosh, I got to deal with the new lay of the land and if we're nervous about it, odds are they're going to be nervous. If we're cool, calm, and collected about it, they're going to be cool, calm, and collected about it. So thanks for bringing that up, Scott. Hey, just a reminder, I think we touched on this a little bit last time, but in the category of what Scott just said, so much of the discussion over the past several months as we've been anticipating the national settlement, you've heard it from so many different angles. It's like we as an industry have to get way better at articulating our value. And I think we talked a little bit about this. So I want you to fire off real quickly, just anything. It doesn't have to be polished, but what is the value that you bring? And I'm going to pick on people if you don't answer.
I'll answer.
Thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome. It's just kind of along the lines of what Scott said, because I've been doing Zillow for a really long time and it's been very, very profitable in my business. One thing when I was starting out and they would say, oh, you're not the listing agent, click, And,
Yeah, right.
I learned how to overcome that objection. I don't know if it was on Zillow training or somewhere else I learned it, but just like Scott did, like keep it kind of nonchalant, but also, hey, yeah, where the selling agent or listing agent would have an agreement with the seller to get the highest, best possible price, then I would be there to help represent a buyer in getting the best possible deal on that house, kind of show a little value that way, and along the lines of what Scott said too. So
yeah, I love that. And it's not too subtle of a point, right? you hit on such a key. Yeah, of course they're calling on a Zillow lead, but you quickly just going like, hey, that's great. You do realize that the listing agent has fiduciaries to the seller and can look out for their interest. I've just found, our company has found, however you want to frame it up, we have found that it really is advantageous to have somebody representing your needs, right? And all we're doing, it's truthful, and
Yeah.
we're injecting a little bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Now, that sounds horrible, but let me say it a different way, injecting a little critical thought, right? Into their mind to be like, yeah, is this really the best setup for me? So I love that. What else you got? What is the other values that we bring? We will represent them and have fiduciaries to them.
Are you asking me or everybody?
Everybody, I'm not putting you on the spot for the whole thing,
Okay.
Rachel.
I'll let someone else go.
I got one, negotiations. I've got one going right now in Eden that just calling the listing agent, talking with her and her spilling all her information. The gentleman bought the property 6 months ago at a certain price and she told us that. So now we don't want to go above that.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen,
And that's hundreds of thousands of dollars.
yeah. And you know what, Dee, you bring up another great point. You're all bringing up great points. But part of the process is, and here's my challenge as we go through a couple more of these. Think about your own, right? But make sure you have a sound bite or something quick to demonstrate what you're talking about. If we just say, oh, I'm a master negotiator as an example, right? I'm really skilled at negotiating on behalf of my clients. Well, guess what? A lot of people say something similar to that. And the way to get them further down the road is to be able to say, you know, in fact, recently I was just working with a client, blah, blah, blah. We negotiated, saved him $15,000 on a transaction. Have a soundbite, a very quick one, right? All right, so negotiations, fact that we have fiduciaries and looking out for their interests. What else? Nothing. We're a two-legged stool. All right, I'll go because there's one that is really embarrassing that we're on this call. Contracts and negotiations, and nobody threw that one out there. Create a sense of urgency. You know what? It's and I try and paint other professionals in our industry into a corner a little bit with this. If I was talking to you, Dee, I'd be like, Dee, you know what? Listen, did you know there's between 23 and 24,000 licensed agents in the state of Utah? And here's what we have found. Half of them haven't done a transaction in the last 12 months. Okay, so what did that just do? Just that by itself. And if they talk to another agent, guess what they're thinking? Are they one of the ones that didn't do a deal in the last 12 months? Right? And this is part of what we do. It's not dishonest. That is actually a fact. And then I'm going to connect a further dot with it. And you know, the sad thing about that, D, is this is probably the biggest transaction in most people's lives. And it takes great care and attention because there's a lot of moving parts. And guess what? Words matter in contracts. And so if you have somebody who isn't experienced and doesn't understand contracts, you could really run afoul. Things could go poorly. However you want to say that. I use weird words. My wife tells me all the time. Run afoul. Anyway, be able to point out to them, I'm going to be your Sherpa. I'm going to take care of you as we climb the mountain of that transaction, right? I know the right paths to take.
Put those back in.
Tyler, comment? Oh, all right. So anyway, don't forget the value of being essentially a contract expert, and don't be afraid to own that. You guys are here and you're learning about the contract, and I'm telling you, most of your peers don't. I've run across so many agents and even brokers who've been in the industry 10, 15, 20 years, and it becomes painfully obvious they've never really completely even read through the contract. They read pieces of it, but never completely understand it. Okay, so remember, use a soundbite for that. You know what? Here's a detail I ran across in a contract that people weren't paying attention. It saved the deal. It did whatever. Have some things at the ready. Okay? That's my challenge to you today. I hope you wrote it down. Have your 4 or 5 value propositions with attendant sound bites or examples. Okay. All right, moving on. I wanted to share with you something here. Just for fun, just a little stat to kick off the day, right? More buyers and sellers think of RE/MAX than any other real estate brand. And that's not insignificant, right? I've had different discussions with people, our own agents, people outside the company when they ask where I work, you know, and work at RE/MAX, and they're like, oh yeah. And there's some type of a comment, like I have yet to really find somebody who's like confused of what space RE/MAX plays in, right? Our brand recognition as far as real estate is above everybody else. And that's not to say there aren't good companies out there, but I hope you understand how valuable that is when people see your name associated with RE/MAX. It's like, oh, I know that Matt is actively involved in real estate. So don't forget that one. I'm going to bounce to another stat here. Let's see, where did that go? There we go. Rapid stats. Not going to spend a ton of time here, but I wanted to touch on this. I hope you are all making this a weekly destination, preferably on a Monday. You come into your Rapid Stats dashboard, which is one click when you're logged into the MLS, and pay attention at least to these three. That way, when somebody asks you the golden question, hey, how's real estate going? You've got something meaningful to say. All right, so what do we do with this? Has anybody been utilizing this as a regular destination? Parker, what do you do with these three stats? Do you just stare at them as they currently are on screen? Muted.
Sorry, I apologize. Sorry, I got all excited and then I wasn't able to help them. No, you can actually go in and you can tweak those stats and you can play with them. So you can cater them to different communities, days back. You can cater them to price ranges. I mean, you can really do a lot to narrow down or expand the search as big as you want to prove a particular point.
Yeah, and you know what? If you did nothing else, then to just be like, okay, so most people are asking us kind of like a temperature read on the market. And, you know, actives, solds, and under contracts kind of form up the basis of that assessment. I know you can get off in the weeds in a lot of different directions, but these are kind of like the three pillars. So if you come in here, you can take, for instance, active listings. Okay, we have 11,212 listings, which is better than it's been in a long time. But if we compared that to 30 days ago, oh, look at that. We're up 2.54%. 60 days ago, we're up by 11% from 60 days ago. 90 days ago, we're up 22%, right? What a great thing. 6 months ago, we're up 56% if you're going to take a listing and you're talking about pricing. Those are some good numbers. You can kind of do the same thing with solds. Look at the past 60 days, what has happened. Oh, and oh, by the way, Mr. Seller, because your pricing needs to be right, not just because there's more competition, but also the number of solds in the past 60 days is down 6%, right? I beat this drum a lot. I hope it's going to it's like talking to my kids sometimes. Sorry, Nicole. Repetition is the mother of learning, so I will repeat it. This is so easy. This is so easy for you to come off as industry knowledgeable, and I hope you're taking advantage of it. Okay. All right, moving on. I'm going to show you one more stat thing, and then we'll get into other things. Anybody know what this is? Taking a quick look. Yeah, Dan knows because we talk about this. Lots of discussion about what's going on with the Fed. So if you go to like different news outlets, the time has come. The Fed just sent a crucial message, basically a retreat to Jackson Hole, Wyoming last week. And they said, yeah, we're going to be moving rates. Well, that's a good overall statement, but how about giving us some information what exactly it means? So geeks like me go to places like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and we search for and find things like the probability matrix of what percentage chance and how much of a change there's going to be. So if you look right here, The next Fed meeting is September 18th, so about 3 weeks out, right? And this is the current rate. The target rate for the Fed is between 500 and 525 basis points. Think 5% to 5.25. That's how much they lend money at, not how much mortgage rates are at. This is kind of where money originates, for lack of a better term. There's a 70% chance that come September 18th, we're going to get a 25 basis point drop. Okay. Then you go to November, about a month and a half later, and say, okay, what's the probability that we get? Remember, this is where we're going to drop to. And then the next one is a 41% chance on November 7th, that we drop another quarter point. But look at this. There's almost a 60% chance that come November, we're going to get a 0.5 point drop. That may not seem like a big deal to you guys, but slight movements in the Fed rate have huge impacts as to what happens in our industry. So let's connect the dots, come full circle.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead, Parker.
So it should be mentioned that it's just like you said, this is the rate that the Fed borrows money. So when we're talking about interest rates and other things like that, it's usually anywhere between 1.5 to 2 points higher than what the Fed rate loans money at. Right. So we're talking about if interest rates right now are sitting at 7. Can you relate that a little bit to what rates are doing if we use that?
Yeah. So we're really at about 6.5 right now. And know this. This doesn't happen the day that the Fed announces the rate cut. Because of probability matrices like this, the market starts adjusting in advance. You'll see rates come down before the Fed actually meets, as long as there's a high probability that they're going to actually do what they say they're going to do. Okay. And so realistically, let's use this example, right? We're gonna by November 7th, there's a 60% chance that we're gonna be 0.75 point lower. So if we're at 6.6 right now, which is kind of where we are, any lenders on the call that want to contradict me, please do. But that means we will be in the high 5s come November 17th. Is that a great thing to know? Right? And you get it by being a geek, or at least being on a call where a geek is talking. And Rhett is the biggest geek of them all, and he'll give you more data on this if you want. But I guess my point is, we should be we should be aware of these things, right? It's not like you have to wake up every day and go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and look at your probability matrix and blah 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 blah. But once a month, sharpening your saw, knowing some of the stats, knowing what the probabilities are, so that when you're talking to a potential buyer, when you're talking to a potential seller, you can add something to the
It looks like
equation.
November is probably a good time to refinance. If that happens.
Say that again, Mindy. I think it was almost like it was part of the conversation. It might be a good time to refinance. Yeah, if it went a little bit lower, but I think she was actually talking to somebody. Go ahead, Dan.
So I've had conversations with some sellers right now that I feel like showings are a little bit lower, and I feel like, and I don't know if this is true, maybe this is a good or bad place to bring up a concern like this, but with 50 of us here, it feels like showings are down a little bit, and it feels like buyers are like, well, the Fed told me they're going to lower rates. I'm just going to wait until they do that in order to buy, right? And so as I'm talking to sellers, how would you talk about that, Matt, as far as, like, hey, there's this narrative out there that interest rates are lowering, and, maybe that's why buyers are kind of sitting on the sidelines. So I'm kind of 2 questions in there. So choose which one you want to answer.
Such a good question, and I love it when we get to, okay, so what does it all mean? What does it all mean? How does rubber meet the road? So remember, we talked about our pillars of value, whether we're working for a seller or a buyer, right? Negotiating, contracts, fiduciaries, industry knowledge, right? And when Dan asked that, or if it's coming from him as the seller, well, Matt, what do what's going on in the market? How does this impact me? I'd be like, Dan, you know what? Strangely, I really do think this is a good time to list. Start off with the conclusion. Don't sit there and bore them to death and then hopefully get to the conclusion. Start with the conclusion first, right? Dan, you know what? This is why it's good you and I are working together, because my company, myself, pretty immersed in what we're doing. Here's what's going on. Can I share three things with you? Number of sales are down, which is also helping drive up inventory, which means we've got to get pricing right. Right? You would agree with that, right? We don't want to overshoot the market so that you sit there for 6 months and then we have to adjust. And I'm future pacing you by saying things like that. And then I'm going to jump into how I kind of bring it together with just some simple stats, the ones I just looked at on rapid stats. It's like, so we know the inventory's gone up.
This thing out and leave us over there.
Mindy, I'm going to mute you. Okay. I'm going to say, listen, so we're anticipating pretty high probability throughout the stat. By November 17th, there's a high probability that we're down 0.5 point to 3/4 of a point, right? What does that mean for you? It means, I mean, we still want to get your pricing right, because if that's a little slower coming to market or fruition, we have like a 30-day window to get maximum excitement exposure about your house. But here's what I can tell you, Dan, to mitigate this. A lot of agents don't understand this. If we have it priced right, we're going to get more people through the house. More people through the house means more offers, right? And even if rates change, that will bring more buyers, which is actually it's counterintuitive. It's going to drive the price up. So this is such a great time for you to get your property listed. Get ahead of the curve, right? Don't wait until, they're good market, bad market. We know this. There's seasonality, and the December, January, February isn't the highest time. I think we're going to buck the trend a little bit this year, but if we can get it listed now, the next 2 months are going to be prime for us. How do you feel, Dan? You want to list right now?
Thanks.
Right? Oh, let's sign me up.
Yeah, sign me up. Okay, so
Matt,
yeah, go ahead, Parker.
so just an example of this, Dan, and I know you and I talk about this all the time when we're visiting with each other, but which, by the way, I visit Dan all the time. It should be mentioned.
I appreciate him running interference.
Yeah. No, I have a listing that's coming up at Suncrest, and they were actually buying with me, and we're going to be listing their home. But the bigger question they had is they called me in June, and they were like, "When should we buy? When should we buy?" And they're like, "Interest rates are so high, we don't want to buy right now." I said, "Look, why don't we look at new construction? Let's put you under contract now, so the rate doesn't tie in until we see that rate drop in September or November." And what it did is it actually lit a flame under them, so they would actively start looking more. And then we use that as an opportunity to then say, now is also a great time to list, because now that we've locked you in on a home that you're going to be building with Edge, we can sell this property you have up in Suncrest, and it's going to be great for you because we won't put it on the market until we see that, right before we see that rate shift. So in the next couple of days, that will be going on the market. But I used that tactic that Matt was talking about specifically to focus them and to build a relationship with them, so that we could continue looking at homes instead of just saying, "Oh, wait until rates drop and I'll see you later." So
well, Parker,
it is effective.
You just hit two words I'm glad you brought up. Did you hear them? Relationship and focus. The real estate space is a pretty broad canvas and can get really confusing for the public really fast. Our job as a professional, and I hope you're all of the same mindset. I do this job, one, because yes, I do want to get paid, and two, because I genuinely want to help people. So I don't want to game them. And so I get a little nervous, and I'm not picking the word, Parker, because I use it too. A tactic almost sounds like you're gaming them. You're not. Just an approach, whatever. Use a more soft term or whatever. But the approach is, right, I care about you as a person. I'm vested in what I do. I've got all these value propositions that I bring, and I'm going to focus your attention on the important things. I'm not saying there aren't other things, Parker, but it's important for us to stay focused on the key points right now. And here's what I'll tell you. We can't spend too much more time on this, or I'm going to not get through my agenda. But if you do the things that I challenged you to this morning, the dialogues tend to start flowing more naturally, right? I can, with confidence and intelligence, and protecting a relationship, and bringing value can sit down with somebody and feel good about what I'm doing and do it well and do it a lot better than most of my competition. Okay? So trust me on that. Keep working on it. Okay. I want to make sure. Oh, by the way, today's mine and Nancy's anniversary, 35 years. Yeah. Woohoo. Just means she's got the patience of Job. That's all that means.
Yeah, I'll text her and tell her sorry.
Yeah, shut up, Parker. Okay. Quick touch on this. Did everybody hear late last week that there was a new lawsuit launched?
Homie.
Yeah. Allison, I'm trying to mute you. There we go.
Homie.
Yeah. Homie filed a lawsuit. And just to be clear, because I've got a few questions about this, I've actually, one of the weirdos who read through the lawsuit, Dan, I know you read through it too. Remax LLC is named, not Remax Associates. That is our corporate entity. They're going to fight the battle on this. You don't need to worry about it. It's entertaining is not the right word. Annoying, but I don't even want to get into the specifics of the case, but I'll just put it into a rough category of, hey, we did a race to the bottom, the market turned, our business failed, and we want to point the finger at everybody else as to why we failed. There's Matt Barton's assessment. But here's the big takeaway. In that lawsuit, if you took the time to go through it, several times they referenced how they were sabotaged as a company, and they cited things that were spoken of on Facebook forums, in real estate forums. I've said this for years. Don't even go on those stupid forums. You actually start becoming part of the liability equation, right? You go in, and Brad Belke at our MLS has said this for years as well. You go in and like something, you can now be construed as part of an effort to undermine a particular company, to be antitrust, anti-competitive. So my daughter told me I coined a phrase in our training last week. Facebook, the echo chambers of stupidity. I didn't know I was coining a phrase, but I kind of like that. And because of that lawsuit, it drives the point home. Guys, I'm not saying there's no value there, but the risk of what you can get caught up in, and frankly, hearing a lot of misinformation and the potential for giving fodder to lawsuits is so not worth it. Come to places like this with the real professionals rather than people who are just bored and claim to be real estate professionals and are just out there pontificating when they don't have a full set of data to address issues intelligently.
You gotta be like Trump. Leave no digital record, no email, no text.
Dan, don't go all political on me.
The exact opposite of what we want to do with our contracts, where we want all of the trails and the communication to be, in writing.
if we're doing our job right and you're being trained right, this is part of it, and it's not like stroking our ego. We're a bunch of professionals getting together to discuss things in a meaningful, productive manner. Notice we didn't say anything about pricing or any other companies other than a lawsuit. This is the right format and the forum. Don't waste your time on the others. All right. Everybody aware of, I'm going to pull it up on screen real quick, and I double check my chat because I can't look at the chat as I'm doing. Oh, good morning. Okay. Share screen. I'm going to bring this up because I've had several questions in the past week about this. Let me get to there's the homie lawsuit. Okay, so the brokerage payment addendum, right? Everybody's familiar with that one. Oops, wrong one. Wow, there it is. Too many docs open. Sorry, guys. This is the brokerage compensation agreement. And just so you know, this is more informational than anything. This is still a good document. It's still valid to use, but we're starting to see a few situations where it's like, why did UAR and therefore the MLS get rid of escrow instructions, right? If you remember where this red arrow starts, this agreement is in contemplation of a real estate transaction. Seems a little contradictory if we're trying to change things in regards to compensation, right? For instance, gross versus net. and I'll give you an example on that. And you know what? Technically, could I use this document for that additional terms? But what is really the biggest problem is that phrase right there, in contemplation of a potential real estate transaction, which seems to at least telegraph that this is supposed to be filled out before. This hasn't been litigated, so we don't really have any, precedents as to whether, this wouldn't work being signed or modified, I should say, after the fact. But having escrow instructions would be just a cleaner way to deal with it. So let me give you the case. We had one in our company where the, and I love it because the agent called proactively before signing something and talking through this. That's always a good measure. Don't sign it and be like, hey, I wonder if I did that right. So the situation was under contract. The buyers needed to have some things paid for, closing costs. We'll put it in a rough category of closing costs. And it's like, well, we're already under contract. This is the agent. We're already under contract. We will play ball. We will raise the price by the amount you want, and then the seller will pay those closing costs at closing. But the seller doesn't want to pay compensation, commissions on the $15,000 increase in price. Is that reasonable? What is that? 15,000, oops, 15,000 times 0.03 as just an example. There's no industry standard. That's $450. I don't know if I'm selling my house, that's not of no consequence. And so, the agent called me up and they're like, well, how do we handle that? I'm like, oh, just use the escrow instructions form, not realizing that UAR had pulled that and therefore the MLS had pulled it and they're not in existence. So I quickly sent out a message to Brad Belke and to Craig Wagner and Lance Harrison at UAR going, hey, you guys need to bring that back or something like it. So if we're stuck with this, then I wanted to kind of give you quickly the rationale on this, even though it says this in contemplation. It doesn't say it's at the exclusion of anything after a real estate transaction is formed. So there's that. And if we'd already agreed up here to say 2.5%, right? Could we do an updated version of this form that says additional terms, but be specific? In addition to the terms agreed to on a real estate brokerage compensation agreement dated such and such, so you don't negate the other one. Right? You want to make sure you're adding to it. Then you could come in here and say additional terms. All compensation to be paid off of, either give a specific amount or to be paid off net, meaning purchase price times the rate minus closing costs.
Hey, Matt.
No, Parker, you've hit your limit. I'm kidding.
Why would we use this when Section 4 now opens the contract up to compensation? Why wouldn't we just create an addendum? Because compensation is already being mentioned in the contract through the standard verbiage. Why wouldn't we just create an addendum that says all of these terms and just add that to the contract?
I am going to open this up to the group. He's saying that since Section 4 of the REPC now has the ability to cover compensation, why would we use this? Anybody have an answer? Testing your contract knowledge. Are they mutually exclusive? Do you always have, let me say it a different way. Do you have to use Section 4 in the REPC?
No.
If you don't use Section 4 in the REPC, what are you going to use?
This.
There you go. There's your answer.
So you're saying if Section 4 isn't completed in the REPC, we would use this.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we go to Section 4, I know I have a copy of that here.
You didn't mention that tidbit when we were talking. when you set up the scenario.
So this is the Section 4 that Parker is talking about. And what is the default? Is it being paid on gross or net?
Gross.
That is the default, right? I know it says somewhere up above. The default in this and the other doc is gross. So yes, to your point, Parker, if you were taking care of compensation in the REPC Section 4.3E in the box here in red, and you wanted to make sure everybody, to make the deal go through, that it was paid on the compensation, the cooperative compensation was paid on net. And even if you want to be more specific, purchase price times the rate, minus closing costs of $15,000. Yes. Could you put that in an addendum? Yes, because it's modifying this term, which is approved by the DRE, to talk about how much the seller is going to pay the buyer's brokerage. Okay. So great point. All right. Wow. I'm really trying to stay on task here. Okay. So just make sure that if coming full circle, if you're going to use the REPC and you need to make further modifications, go ahead and use an addendum to the REPC, but please practice good contract writing. Don't just start talking. Like, it's almost like sometimes it's a stream of consciousness endeavor, right? We just start writing the thoughts that come into our mouth. It's always a good practice to specifically reference the section that we're talking about, right? When I write stuff, I always like to say buyer and seller agree, right? There's some psychology behind that. It makes it harder for them to come back later and argue because it was specifically stated up front. Buyer and seller agree that section 4.3E to be modified to whatever the verbiage is, to reflect only being paid on net, not versus gross. Okay. And if we were using the compensation agreement, the other form, I would do the same thing and just say, both parties agree that the compensation specified in section 2 of the real estate brokerage compensation agreement to be modified however. Okay, you with me? Sweet. All right.
Hey, Matt,
Yes, go ahead.
to add some additional layers to this, this particular deal that you're referencing, it went under contract prior to the changes of the REPC, and so there wasn't the section of 4.3 to talk that discussed compensation. And then escrow instructions kind of went away, and so during the transaction, the buyer and the seller wanted to modify the terms of the agreement, adding in the closing costs that the buyer wanted to pay, and the seller was like, well, I'll do it, but I don't want to pay off of gross or net, whatever. And so and then escrow instructions went away, and so we lost the approved form to modify the agreed upon compensation for both parties.
Right.
And so this was like a scramble. What do we do?
Yeah.
And so hopefully moving forward, right, we'll have really solid language in section 4 with compensation and commissions, and then we can directly within the REPC address some of the modifications that we want to change, whether it's gross to net or a different percentage or a specific dollar amount or whatever the case may be. But on this one, it really got kind of complex because the typical forms that we used to use to address these things just vanished.
Right.
So
this is what
additional layers of complexity within this particular deal.
This is what we would call national settlement collateral damage.
Right. Right. Because you got the in between. So moving forward, like in the buyer's agent tried to address compensation in an addendum. Yeah. And then there's nothing in the contract that had addressed compensation previously. And I said, well, what are you referring to? Like, what section of the agreement are you referring to? So fortunately, I think something that's really good for all of us to understand is if you have something that is under contract and the MLS had a promise of compensation, and that BAC or BDC in the MLS is the only thing that's contractual in the MLS, right? And so if there was a promise of compensation there, that is still in effect and will govern how parties will get paid. And so this one wanted to modify that, and like our ability to modify it got clouded. We worked through it, right? So if you have questions on this, Matt can certainly help you work through it. But moving forward, hopefully we won't have that issue. But in the meantime, while we have deals that went under contract previous to October or August 17, if you have to modify those things, there's methods we can do it, but it gets a little messy.
For sure. And order of the day is reach out to a broker first. Don't try and handle it all yourself. it's not to say that we have everything dialed in, but can we do triage and get you largely there? Yes. And is this a short-term thing as those tweeners bleed out and go away over time? Yeah. And guess what? Here's the other thing. I have a sneaky suspicion that the DRE is going to be a little more lenient as we transition to this new landscape, so that if it's one of those tweeners and somebody were to talk about, compensation being gross or net, on a particular transaction, and that was put into a REPSI, I'm not sure that the DRE is going to be super jacked up to come after people for that in the near term. Okay, fun stuff. All right, so and hopefully we'll have escrow instructions back soon. Or guess what we're going to do as a company? We're going to create our own version, and we're going to have our own version of escrow instructions, which will look strangely a lot like the former UAR form, but not exactly, because it's copyrighted. All right. Next thing I want to talk about was really quickly just the brokerage clauses. We talked about those last week, and I just wanted to show you two little tweaks. Okay, if I go to SkySlope Forums, here we go. Oh, stay signed in, please, please, please. Okay, so this is the one we worked on last week, and because of Daryl's comments and the situation, which was totally valid, came up with this verbiage. So this is a situation where, how do we handle it if our compensation agreement or whatever says 3% and something comes in less than 3%, as an example of an arbitrary commission amount which is not set anywhere by the industry, NAR, MLSs, etc. Okay, so per section 2.2 of the buyer broker agreement, which is the satisfaction of brokerage fee by a third party section, company agrees that if the buyer acquires a property where seller and or seller's brokerage offers a cooperative compensation less than the amount specified in 2.1, which is where we put our amount, right, 2.1, the cooperative compensation will satisfy the buyer's obligation to the company specified in 2.1, provided the cooperative compensation is not less than 2% and 295. Okay, are we good so far? So if we have 3% in our buyer broker and another brokerage pays 2.5%, and you have this verbiage as an addendum to your buyer broker agreement, then the 2.5 is going to satisfy what the company needs to be paid. Okay, now
Is this ingrained? Meaning we can't change this verbiage?
No,
or is
I'm in
are we
edit
able
mode
to
right
edit
now,
this?
Parker.
Okay, well, you're the broker, so I was just wondering if on the template side, if we're also able to go in here and say 2.5 or 3 or 4 or 6 or whatever.
For sure. All this does is set the floor. It doesn't say how much you put in section 2.1. You could put 10% there, right? And then this would still be appropriate language, because if something came in less than that, as long as it didn't go below 2% and 295, the company's like, you're still okay. Okay. Then of course, right, that was the provided section. But this part, if the cooperative compensation is less than this amount, the minimum amount, sorry, because I previously defined that minimum amount, buyer will be required at closing to pay the minimum amount of 2% and 295 minus any cooperative compensation from the seller or the seller's brokerage. Okay, so if they offered 1.75 by way of cooperative compensation, with this addendum in place, they'd only come in with 1/4 point in 295. Make sense? I'm going to give you another version of this and see, because I was looking at it and they tend to cover the same thing. So I don't know if you like this verbiage better, because it says, dang it. Where did that go? Oh, here it is. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. All right, so this is a different way of saying the same thing. buyer brokerage, brokerage fee, section 2.1 of the exclusive buyer broker agency disclosure on a successfully closed transaction, if the brokerage fee owed from the buyers to the company is not covered by cooperative compensation from the seller or the seller's brokerage, the buyer will be obligated to pay one of the following to the brokerage. And then there's two use cases. If they were offering zero, then number one applies. If there's literally no cooperative compensation, then number one applies, which is, well, then you as the buyer are obligated to pay to the company $295 plus 2%. That's pretty straightforward, right? Nothing confusing there. Or if cooperative compensation offered by the seller's brokerage is greater than the company minimum, which was defined right here, right? The cooperative compensation will satisfy the buyer's obligation contained in section 2.1, period. If it's 2 1/4, we're good. If it's 2 1/2, we're good. If it's 2 3/4, we're good. But if the cooperative compensation is less than the company minimum, buyer will pay at closing the difference between the company minimum and the amount of the cooperative compensation actually paid.
Sounds a lot like the verbiage from the previous REPC.
That's right. I
Yeah.
don't know if it looks better because we have two use cases versus having it all in a paragraph where it's not as easy to differentiate, but kind of wanted to get a vote which one you guys prefer. So hold up your hand, number one or number two would you be your preference? Come on.
So when we say number one, number two, we're talking about addendum, not the paragraphs.
I'm talking about this. This is option 2, this
Yeah.
particular verbiage versus
Yeah,
the
option
one I
2.
just read. So
Yeah.
we've got a lot of votes for 2. Do I have any that are like insisting that they like number 1 better?
Shorter the better.
Nicole's voting for number 1, or at least she's telling you, Dad, you're number 1.
Definitely Dad's number one. That's it.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, yeah, I think what I will do if I go back out and look at brokerage clauses, I will probably get rid of this. I'll probably use this title, the post-national EBB gap post-national settlement, and replace it with the verbiage that's contained in this one, which was option 2. Okay. All right. Looking at my agenda. All right. So had a situation this week. See if I can bring it up on screen. This was sent by Matt Register. I always appreciate it when you guys can share things with me so I can actually show them. Where are you, Matt Register? There we go. He sent this. He's like, hey, is this legit? Can you guys see this okay? And he's got a snippet from the MLS and it says, agent remarks, seller offering 2% for buyer's concession. And by the way, learn how to spell concessions, and it wasn't Matt. This is the agent. Anyway, can we do this? Can we say that the seller is offering concessions of 2% in the remarks?
Yeah.
What are concessions?
Concessions are for the buyer and seller.
So give me an example of a concession.
Okay. So buyer
home
says
warranty? Home warranty?
Home warranty would be one. Closing costs would be another. Contribution towards, well, I guess we could count that as closing costs, but contribution to buy down the rate. All of those things are considered concessions.
It's concessions, not compensation.
Yeah, sorry. Let me pronounce that right. Concessions.
Yes. So the distinction I wanted to make on this was he wasn't saying in the agent remarks, seller offering 2% in cooperative compensation. That would be a violation of the national settlement. But there's nothing in the national settlement as it stands today that says a seller can't say, hey, we'll pay a buyer's closing costs. Hey, we'll pay for a home warranty. Hey, we'll pay whatever. And that is in the broad category of concessions. There is some discussion that, the DOJ may eventually look at concessions because they may in the future see it as a way for them to, just essentially substitute one fee for another where, but I think they've got a long ways to go on that. And so don't get freaked out if you see in remarks that the seller's offering to pay concessions. Freak out if they say compensation, just not concessions. Okay.
I think concessions are helpful. Imagine going to a buyer and saying, good news, these guys are going to pay your closing costs.
Right.
That's great for
Yeah.
if it's for a first-time home buyer. That's great.
And you know what? And that is something to make our listings more enticing. If
Yeah.
we're not wanting to listen, there's a whole bunch of different thoughts on this. Some people are going out to their listing, go, you don't have to pay anything. I think that's disingenuous. You know, they can say you know, you can put a certain amount and then we can always negotiate later. Fine, that's cool. That's kind of what the design was to a certain degree by the DOJ. But if they want to sweeten the offer and make it clear to everybody, right? Because right now, since there's not a BAC, a BBC field, it's still going to be negotiated, right? A seller could put full price offer, willing to pay 2% in concessions. How would you make that contractual, by the way? Because it's just on the MLS. And as we all know, in case you forgot, I'm going to bring it up real quick here. Real quick is a relative term. Rep C section 14. This is a very important section. The Rep C, together with its addenda, any attached exhibit, seller's disclosures, constitutes the entire agreement between the parties, and here's the key language, and supersedes and replaces any and all prior negotiations, representations, warranties, understandings, or contracts between the parties, whether verbal or otherwise. So you put it in the MLS that the seller is willing to pay 2% in concessions. How do you make it contractual?
Put that in the addendum.
You could add an addendum, or I could go to section
Attach it.
9 and check other and say, see exhibit 1. What's exhibit 1?
The MLS printout.
Correct. And have it labeled exhibit 1. And then it becomes contractual. Right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So just, you know, just ways to structure it and make sure that our clients are covered. Okay. Since we are on this form, I want to jump to one more topic. Here in the ERS, I'm going to direct you to section 16. A very important section. It's important for us as a company. It's important for me as a principal broker, who's one of my primary responsibilities is to reduce risk to the company, to you as an agent, and to your clients. And so my office managers are going to love me for covering this. In the list, in the ERS, it says the following: the listing agreement, including the UAR approved seller's property condition form, data form, that would be known as the MLS input form, wire fraud disclosure, and any additional addendum to the ERS contain the entire agreement between the parties. All right, put on your legal hats. If I'm missing one of these documents, do I have the entire agreement?
Nope.
It's not a tough question. No, you do not. If you do not have the entire agreement, when the components of the entire agreement are spelled out, you don't potentially have a meeting of the minds. And meeting of the minds is required in contract law for the formation of a contract. If you don't have meeting of the minds, very easy to challenge. We never had a formation of contract because there was an agreement. So please, please, please don't give your office managers a hard time when they call you and be like, hey, congratulations on your listing that you want to get going. We're just missing the data input form, right? And people, here's just a smattering of the excuses. Oh, we're not putting it on the MLS. Doesn't actually say that in the ERS. You only need to provide it if it's not on the MLS. More importantly than everything that I just said in regards to that listing input form, if you put it on the MLS and you don't have a listing input form, who is the originator of the data? You are. The company is, right? I mean, we go to painstaking efforts at UAR writing these forms to make sure that we have protections in there. For instance, we specify where's the square footage coming from? Is it coming from county records and appraisal? Is the seller just making a WAG, you know, a big guess? That's so that we are not the originating source of data. When we become the originating source of the data, we instantly get lumped into the liability game, right? Using just square footage as an example. If we were to just sit there and be like, well, I don't have a data input form and I'm going to put it on the MLS and it's got, I don't know, it looked like about 3,500 square feet. It's not even that you may not be able to prevail because of things like Section 14, but you could get lumped into, you know, a lawsuit. Simple example, I used this in the past, so if you're on the call in the past, I apologize, but it's one that we actually just got dismissed from a lawsuit. Woohoo! On Friday. And it was a situation where one of our agents did his job and did have the listing input form, and his client had marked the box that there was a bedroom in the basement, and that bedroom was just absent one critical component, which was
Egress.
A window.
a window. Yeah. And so this is really a good example for all of us. One, let's do a little bit better job at the front end. Walk the property. Don't just rely on what your client puts on a data input form wherever possible. And say, hey, man, did you realize you marked on the input form that you have a bedroom, but it's missing a window? Because even though we got dismissed, it still caused an E&O deductible of $10,000. So even getting dismissed has a price, right? So this is why I tell you guys, victories in the litigation arena rarely are actually a win. It's a lose and a lose more proposition almost always. So that's why this data input form is so important for us. I was talking with one of our office managers this morning and have a particular agent that we've bumped into a couple of these where we don't, scenario is this, either we don't have a listing input form, that's bad, or almost equally as bad, and maybe even worse, is a listing input form that is signed and has no data. Who's still the originating source of data? We are. And, you know, it's very easy to connect the dots and put us into that liability game. So let's make sure that we don't do that, okay? One more scenario. I know we're almost out of time. I'm going to finish with this one. Because of the new scheme, the new landscape of the national settlement and negotiable commissions, realize this: when we sign a ERS, when we sign an exclusive buyer broker agreement, it's known as a bilateral contract. And I'm not trying to get all, you know, uppity with terms and stuff like that, but it means there's two parties that sign it, right? And any changes, it even says in the documents themselves, any changes must be in writing, just like a REPSI, right? An individual party cannot go and then make a change, cannot make a unilateral change to a bilateral contract. So if we sign a listing agreement with somebody, and this is the situation that Dan and I got to deal with on Saturday, I'm not mentioning any names because it's happened before, it will probably happen again, and I want to make sure you're all equipped and prepared to deal with it. If somebody signs a listing agreement with you, and I joke about this with some of my neighbors. I'm like, I hate doing business in my own neighborhood, right? Because, and this isn't for you, everybody, but it's just me. I'm like, because I found over the years, if I sell something fast, I haven't worked for my commission. If I take too long, I'm not good at my job. So I tend to want to do business with strangers who just have a higher level of appreciation and aren't looking for a way to shoot me down. But with that kind of as a backdrop, if we sign a listing agreement, we're essentially under contract, not under REPSI. We're under contract between buyer and brokerage or seller and brokerage. And then what happens is something like this. The seller comes and says, hey, Dan, I found a buyer all by myself, and you really haven't had to work very hard. So can we just agree, to pay whatever, $1,000? All right. Real story, truly happened. What do you think I'll test you guys' read on Matt Barton as principal broker. What's my reaction? What do I say to that?
Hell no.
And you don't get it answered. What,
Yeah.
Nicole?
The rent
I
is
said,
due.
oh no, that's what you would say.
Yeah, Nicole, I agree with you. I just said the rent is due.
Yeah.
There's a contract, you have to pay.
Okay. And that is true. And that's coming, I would put that in the category at the far left of the spectrum of, okay, this is principal. This is the principal. You signed a contract with the company, right? Now, we want to foster relationships, right? And could we stay on principal? 100%. And you know what? Depending on the situation, depending on the personalities, we may stay on principal. But on the other end of the spectrum, the right side, we may say, you know what, this relationship's pretty important to us. And they kind of have a point. It's a $500,000 house. They're paying 6%. The buyer's unrepresented. If we go by the contract, I mean, it's 2 days later, and all of a sudden, 6% on 500,000, we're going to ask them to cop $30,000. Could we do it? Yeah, we could. Is it going to be maybe a little challenging to keep that person as a client, or are they going to feel like, man, they kind of screwed me? I mean, I was ready to pay them if they found a buyer, and it was only less than 48 hours, and my Uncle Bob just decided to buy it, and now they want to be paid $30,000 for that. I'm just painting two scenarios so we understand the argument. We as a company want to be flexible, but we also, in turn, expect you as our agents to understand what it takes to run a company, to have, brick and mortar with lights and heating and air conditioning and staff and systems, and that those have costs. And so we shouldn't be too quick nor too cavalier with the compensation. I think if I was to and ask for each of you, before saying anything, be like, you know what, I really do appreciate the question, Jeff. It's valid, but I don't have the authority to just go and change a contract that's signed by the company. So if you'll give me a day or so to go talk with my brokers and figure out what we can do. Is that hard to have that dialogue? Harder at all?
No.
I mean, the good news is it makes the company and your principal broker the bad guy, and your worst case scenario, the messenger. Best case scenario, you're still the good guy. And so there's methodology to it. And I'll just tell you guys, as a general framework, again, there's an asterisk on this. If it really is the situation that I just painted, the company's our starting point is we're going to get a percent, period. Right? Why? Why do we charge 1%?
Because we have overhead.
Okay, that's part of it, for sure. What else? Is our name on the contract? Is our name on the contract in Section 5?
Yeah.
Is there the potential that something goes sideways on the deal and we get lumped into a lawsuit?
Always.
Always. And you know what? Very low probability. But the ones that do are substantial enough that we have to spread that risk across all of our transactions. And so it's not the company saying, oh, I don't want to help you, Dan. It's, hey, we are willing to play ball. I mean, our starting point is we could collect the 6%. We're not doing that. We're asking for some help from the buyer as well to cover our risk by being on the contract and acknowledging that we're coming way, way, way off of our price, 1%. Right? Now, I would just say this too. If we go down that path, please make sure in your ERS, let me share my screen one more time and then we'll be done. In your ERS, I have it highlighted in yellow. Please remove these sections. If we're not really going to be marketing the property, then I don't want the liability of having keys. And if I'm not going to have keys, it makes no sense to have a key box installed on the property. And we're certainly not going to hold an open house, right? this is in the category, some of these things are in the category of implied duties. If we leave them as is, somebody could come back later and say, well, you didn't do what you signed up to do. And here's the last point. The last point is, if we're going to make an exception on an existing executed ERS, please make sure it's only for one buyer, right? Don't use universal language, because I don't know, do buyer deals ever fall out? Yeah. And if they do, it's really hard for us to go back up to what our original terms was, because the seller's like, hey, you did it on that one, right? It's just easier if we say, listen, all terms are going to stay the same unless Bob Jones and his wife buy the house. If they do, here's what we're agreeing to. Otherwise, we're going back to the original terms. Make it easy on yourself. Say yes, but at the same time, protect yourself in case the deal doesn't go through. Make sense? I'll take your silence as quiet acquiescence that it.
Hey, Matt, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Hey, just looking at the methodology with all the changes on the residential listing input form, I'm fairly decent at getting, going through with the client, but the remark is something I like to do by myself after I have all the information. Is it okay if I just enter the listing, do the remarks, and then send that to the client to sign the actual MLS next to the remarks so that they validate that they've agreed to those remarks?
Dang you, Scott. No, it's a good question. Of course, our preference is to have a signed listing input. That's the easiest way, right? It's clean. But I will say, we have a paper trail, and all the fields typically that are on the MLS, as long as they're populated, right? The example I used, yes, that would be our fallback position if for some reason input couldn't be signed, and especially, or if it's just the remarks that you're talking about. Yeah,
it's just the remarks. I'd have the whole thing signed, but the remarks would be blank, and then I would go
and
and
that's
have
probably
them
the
sign
most
it.
common. And yes, just have their initial down by the remarks themselves. Here's an example of that. I had one a few years ago where the listing agent, I was representing the buyers, put in the listing, in the remarks, in all caps, by the way, all fees to Mapleton City have been paid and all utilities are stubbed to the property. Well, the fees had been paid to Mapleton City, but guess what was not stubbed to the property? Electricity, right? And we talked to Rocky Mountain Power, and it was 3 lots away, and it was $4,500 to get the electrical to the house. And that created some problem for the agent, because I went back to him and I said, hey man, help me understand, how did we get here, right? Do you have paperwork that is signed by your seller saying that all utilities are stubbed? Guess what the agent said? No, I just put that in myself because I thought they were. That creates a problem. So yeah, if we're going to do it, make sure we have a signature on those remarks from a printout, and make sure that gets uploaded into SkySlope, and we'll be golden in regards to remarks. Okay.
Thank you.
You guys are the best. Thanks for kicking off your Monday the right way. I hope you have a highly productive, highly engaging Monday. And remember this, if no other year you did it this way, do it this way this year. Stay engaged. Don't do like I've watched for years as a principal broker. Don't go, oh crap, oh, school's back in session, and I kind of slow down 10%, and then it's like, oh hey, it's Labor Day, I slow down another 10%. By the time we get to Thanksgiving, or even worse, Halloween, it's like, yeah, I'm running at 50%. I showed you that probability matrix from the Fed by design, because I knew I was going to finish with this point. If you stay engaged, the market's been slow, there's pent-up demand, pricing's going to get better. But if you check out like most of your peers do over the next 2-3 months, you're going to lose the opportunity. This is the year to not check out. Stay engaged. Okay? Have a good one.
Thanks, Matt.
Talk
Thanks,
to you
Matt.
soon. Okay, see ya.
All right.
Thank you.